Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second plenary of the conference. My name is Judy Browse, as many of you know, and I'm the Executive Director of NAAEE, and I hope you had a first great day of sessions today. You are in for such a wonderful plenary today. It's all about the role of education in helping to protect biodiversity. And we have a panel with three wonderful conservationists, Dr. Wynn-Grant, and Jennifer Morris, moderated by our own Jaime González. And I'll introduce Jaime shortly, who will then introduce our panelists. I first want to thank all the sponsors who have made this conference possible. We couldn't do it without all of them. We're just so grateful to their support. And I especially want to highlight Conservation Nation and the Sustainable Forestry Initiative for supporting this particular plenary. Both are wonderful groups, and you'll get a chance to hear from the CEO of SFI, Kathy Abuso, who is here to welcome you as well in just a minute. So I wanted to tell you that this session is really near and dear to my heart. I have worked most of my life at the intersection of conservation, education, and justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and always looking at the people part of conservation. And I am so excited about the lineup we have today. As many of you know, the loss of biodiversity is staggering. Every day we hear more news about losses of species, of wild spaces, and the cultural sites that have so much deep meaning for so many. Just last week in the United States, we heard that the ivory-billed woodpecker and 26 other species were declared extinct by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And internationally, there have been so many reports of biodiversity loss, including concerns about overfishing the nearly extinct bowmouth guitarfish from Indonesia. According to one recent report, more than 40% of amphibian species, almost 33% of reef-forming corals, and more than a third of all marine mammals are threatened. And there is also a close connection, as many of you know, between biodiversity and indigenous peoples around the world. At last week's research symposium keynote, Megan Bang highlighted that indigenous territories contain more than 80% of the world's biodiversity, and that 95% of WWF's climate hotspots are in indigenous territories. We also know around the world that we are having trouble building the workforce we need to tackle the biodiversity crisis. It's sometimes really hard for young people to find a pathway into conservation work. Many young people don't even know what the opportunities are, and they don't see themselves reflected in the field, or they don't have the financial support to take non-paying internships or low-paying entry-level positions. But there is so much hope and so many wonderful things taking place around the world, from the recent announcement from the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, on the expansion of the Bears Ears National Monument and Grand Staircase to embrace indigenous knowledge and protect biodiversity, as well as to the recent commitment from the Nature Conservancy and its partners to protect 236,000 acres of tropical habitat in Belize, just as two examples. We will hear more from our speakers about their perspectives on biodiversity, what is happening, how we can eliminate barriers to attracting new leaders into the profession, and how education can be a critical tool to achieve conservation success. And we know that many of you work in conservation, and we couldn't have a better panel today to talk about how education can be the secret sauce of conservation success, as our moderator, Jaime González, often says. So before we get to our panel, I am now excited to introduce Kathy Abuso, who has done so much to promote conservation and education in her work with SFI and PLT. Kathy is the president and CEO of SFI, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, a nonprofit leader advancing sustainability through collaboration. And under Kathy's leadership, SFI has evolved into a solutions-oriented sustainability organization that works across four key pillars: standards, conservation, community, and education. A key driver of SFI's success is Kathy's ability to engage networks to do more good work in the forest and conservation sector. Kathy has committed her energy to forest literacy and building a diverse and resilient workforce. In 2017, she led SFI's acquisition of Project Learning Tree, an award-winning EE program that advances environmental literacy and stewardship using trees and forests as windows on the world. She has reimagined and refocused PLT to link EE with forest literacy and green jobs in the renewable forest sector. And in 2018, she also helped create PLT Canada. Kathy is such a strong voice for women in conservation. She's a dedicated mentor to other women in the forestry sector. She was a co-founder of Women for Nature, and she is a member of Canada's National Steering Committee for Gender Equity in the Forest Sector. Let's give Kathy a warm virtual applause. Take it away, Kathy.
Thanks, Judy. And hey, I have nothing left to say. You did such a great job introducing me. So I'll for sure stay within my 5 minutes. But thanks for those warm words of welcome. And so nice to be preceding Jennifer Morris and Dr. Ray Wynn-Grant on a really important conversation today. And we're really excited about our work, which is really about collaboration and how can we advance sustainability issues through collaboration. And we know that environmental education is critical to that success. Next slide. And so it was a great honor in the end of 2017 to take on Project Learning Tree and really work with important partners like NAAEE and our vast and present state network of Project Learning Tree to advance environmental education, environmental stewardship, and really to help help young adults and children know how to think, not what to think. And we've developed Project Learning Tree over the last few years to really look at a career pathway to inspire this generation to careers where they can make a meaningful difference. So, and we're providing a variety of services to help them get there. So it starts with the K-8 guide and even earlier educational tools, but then we get into career connections and skills development, mentorship programs, and even green job placements that I'll tell you a wee little bit about. Next slide. And thanks to our powerful network of state coordinators, we reach about 2.3 million students every single year. And that's through professional development, education, curriculum, and as I said, our important network. But we'd like to reach more people, and it is through collaboration with organizations like yours that we know that we can do more good. Next slide. And so one of the things that we're really working on is bringing conservation into the classroom. One of the cool things about PLT now being housed at SFI is we have all of these great conservation partnerships with conservation leaders where we're quantifying the biodiversity maintained or recovered, or best management practices to maintain or recover species, or best management practices to store carbon or purify our water through sustainable forest management. And these partnerships can be case studies in some of our curriculum, which is wonderful to bring sort of real research and real understanding into the classrooms. Next slide. One of the new products, well, it's a long-standing product, is our K-8 activity guide, but it's just been revamped, and it's called Explore Your Environment. And over 90% of the activities in here can be taken outdoors. So this is really relevant during COVID, and it allows young people to really explore nature and develop some of the 21st century skills like student voice, problem solving, teamwork, and curriculum and collaboration as well. But we've also are so aware of the power of trees through new initiatives like 1t.org, and we're also aware of the threat to climate change through catastrophic forest fires. So we're also trying to bring relevant content from the world around us and everyday experiences into the classroom as well with some of these new tools and curriculum. Next slide. One of the things that we're super happy with, and we'd like to do more of, looking for partners in the US, is Project Learning Tree Canada's work in developing careers. And Judy talked about the importance of paid work experiences. Well, since 2018, when we started Project Learning Tree Canada, we've placed over 3,700 young adults in the ages of 15 to 30 in green jobs in the forest and conservation sector. And we've placed them with over 200 employers from the SFI network and the Canadian Parks Council network. And this is where young adults can get experience as ecologists, biologists, and carbon modelers. And it's so nice that they're well-paid jobs, and we provide a wage match. And we also have internship programs, thanks to funding from the Government of Canada. And we hope that the USDA and others in the US will also step up to help provide funding like this, so we can do similar programming in the US. And what's unique about these job placements is we really do strive and have achieved gender balance in these placements. And we also work with underserved communities, youth-facing barriers, and over 20% of our jobs placed are Indigenous youth. And so we've learned through that we need to create additional tools and stories and dedicated mentorship program for these young adults to so that they can have experiences and learn from others that look like them, and perhaps have had experiences like them. And that's some of the connective tissue and connective work that we're doing through these tools. Next slide. And I'm really pleased to say I just, before joining this call, I just finished a call with our All Black African American Advisory Committee that is really helping us recreate similar content that we did in Canada, but for the US, which is going to feature a wide variety of careers in conservation and the forest sector, and show the journey of Black professionals in these green careers, how they got there, some of the struggles that they had to overcome, and also advice for employers. It's also going to cover the meaningful difference that they're making in these careers, and hopefully inspire others to pursue careers in forest and conservation work. Next slide is really just my thank you slide to thank Judy for having me here today, and for our great partnership with NAAEE and many of you. One of the big opportunities with Project Learning Tree in SFI is that we have a vast network where we're known to scale impact. And so we do that through collaboration like organizations like yours, and just want to thank you all for your continued partnership. Thanks, Judy.
Kathy, thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here, and I really appreciate all you've done to support education and conservation and the equity work that you are doing. And many of our state affiliates, as you know, are also PLT coordinators, so that's a really nice blend, and we look forward to continuing our partnership as we go forward. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Judy.
And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jaime González, our moderator for today. Jaime is the Secretary of the Board of Directors for NAAEE and the Director of the Houston Resilient Cities with the Nature Conservancy in Texas. Jaime works with communities in Greater Houston to co-create a healthier, more equitable, climate resilient, and more biologically diverse region using nature-based solutions. Jaime is one of more than 20 Nature Conservancy city leads using nature-based solutions to build healthier cities throughout North America and the world. Jaime co-founded the Coastal Prairie Partnership and has degrees in curriculum and instruction, science education, and biology from the University of Houston. And he is a leader in bridging the role that EE plays in achieving conservation success and inspiring positive change in communities. For those of you who know Jaime, it's not surprising that he's won a number of awards for his work to protect biodiversity and to support education. And we are so lucky to have him with us tonight to moderate this panel that includes his own boss. So Jaime, take it away, and let's give him a warm virtual welcome.
Thank you so much, Judy. And I just have to thank the NAAEE team, including Ann Amali and Lori Mann and the rest of the team for providing us with such a wonderful venue to have a conversation with two of the real stars of conservation. We're privileged to have both of them here today. Also wanted to thank Kathy Abuso. I think that we all saw the exciting and inspiring work that is happening at SFI and how it is so multidimensional. Lastly, I want to thank our amazing audience here today. And I would just like to say that having a rich dialogue is always aided by the active participation of any audience. And so I have the distinct pleasure today of facilitating a conversation between our two stellar panelists, but also with you all in the audience. So at certain points, we'll take breaks to take questions from the audience. We'll have 2 of those breaks. We'll also ask you to respond to a Mentimeter poll, actually 2 polls, at different times of the program. So we'd like you to chime in there, and our team from NAAEE is going to put those Mentimeter polls in the chat when it's appropriate. We'll also have a chance to see 2 exciting videos that are showcasing the work that TNC and Dr. Wynn-Grant is doing out in the field to protect and enhance biodiversity across the planet. So with that, I am going to ask our NAAEE team to put our first Mentimeter poll in the chat. We'll take a look at that result in just a minute. But before we do, I'm going to go ahead and we are going to get to know our 2 panelists today. I'll go ahead and read you their bios, and then we'll ask them to tell us a little bit more about themselves and what's really inspiring them today. Okay, the first introduction is for Dr. Wynn-Grant. She is a wildlife ecologist with an expertise in uncovering how human activity influences carnivore behavior and ecology. In particular, she focuses on the ecological and social drivers of human-carnivore conflict. Her current field system encompasses the central coast of California, where she's studying the unique ecology of carnivores in coastal zones, as well as the role of protected areas and connectivity of high-quality habitat for large carnivores. Her previous research questions surrounded the ecological drivers of human-carnivore conflict with grizzly bears in the northern Great Plains, black bears in the western Great Basin, African lions in rural Kenya and Tanzania, as well as grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone region. Very exciting stuff. A native Californian, Dr. Wynn-Grant attributes her interest in wildlife and conservation from the television shows she watched as a child. I could relate. She was introduced to the field of conservation biology as an undergraduate and is unapologetic about her passion for studying charismatic megafauna. Dr. Wynn-Grant serves on the board of directors for NatureBridge, where she largely aids the organization in their equity, inclusion, and diversity strategies. She received her BS in environmental studies from Emory University, her MS in environmental studies from Yale University, and her PhD in ecology and evolution from Columbia University. She completed a conservation science research and teaching postdoctoral fellowship with the Center of Biodiversity and Conservation at the American Museum of Natural History, and is currently a research faculty member at the Burns School of Environmental Science and Management, leading carnivore research at the Jack and Laura Dangerman Preserve. She also maintains a research fellow position with National Geographic Society, focusing on carnivore conservation in partnership with the American Prairie Preserve, and a visiting scientist position at the American Museum of Natural History. I sometimes shorten these biographies, but we have such stellar panelists today. I really wanted you to hear how rich the diversity of experiences they have. So I think that this is, just reading these bios just gives me the chills. All right, for our next exciting bio, Jennifer Morris. For the past 25 years, Jennifer Morris has dedicated her life to protecting the environment for both people and nature. She brings decades of global leadership, proven management skills, and a passion for conservation to the organization and its ambitious mission, conserving the lands and waters on which all life depends. Almost 30 years ago, Jennifer was teaching in Namibia with an eye on a career path in public health. Years of working and living in a small community showed her that the health of each individual and each family was inextricably linked to the health of the environment. This realization propelled her to serve by working on economic development, and she went on to receive her master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University with a focus on business development and microfinance. After a short stint at Women's World Banking, she joined Conservation International, where she oversaw all programs from across 29 countries and more than 600 million hectares of protected land. She developed some of CI's most enduring programs and partnerships and innovative strategies using business development as a tool to protect nature for the well-being of humanity. She led more than 1,000 staff comprising scientists, policy experts, and passionate conservation professionals to implement cutting-edge initiatives and work with more than 2,000 diverse partners. Jennifer is a passionate storyteller, an avid outdoors enthusiast, and a mentor to future generation of conservation leaders. She lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband and her daughter. So as you can see, we have people that have a broad set of skills, experiences, and passions. And so we got to hear kind of their CVs, how they have shown up and showed out for the world in terms of conservation, which is amazing. But we want to get to know them as individuals as well. So I'm going to give them about 3 or 4 minutes, give or take, to tell us a little bit more about yourselves as people and what's exciting you right now in the field of conservation. And we'll go ahead and start with you, Ray.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who is here joining us. It's quite an honor to be here talking to everybody. I hope it's obvious from that really, really long bio and introduction that education has played a major role in my life. I feel like I have all the formal education, and in the years since I have gotten some of my degrees, I have just taken so many deep dives into different types of informal education. And so I truly feel that I'm a lifelong learner, and I owe a huge debt of gratitude to all of the educators who helped me along the way and who continue to help me. But I love being able to start with, some really authentic articulations of who I am. And then I can't wait to hear Jen's answer to this question. I consider myself, very, very strongly an intersectional person. So a lot of my public identity is tied to nature and the environment and wildlife conservation. And I do feel so strongly grateful that I have a huge passion for my job. I have to have a job no matter what. I'm, not, inherently wealthy. And so I just know that it is such an honor to love what I do, to be energized by what I do, to be super intellectually stimulated by what I do, and have the opportunity to collaborate with so many amazing people. And with that said, I do have an identity that's pretty different outside of my work life. And I do like to kind of bring that to the forefront as well. I'm a parent. I am a family member. I am someone who is probably pretty unapologetic about my urban lifestyle. I often describe to young people that I feel very much like I have a double life, so I spend about half of my time in the year in the field. So in the wilderness, living outside, camping, doing data collection, learning in a very hands-on way about wild animals. And I know that we have a little video that will introduce some of that work. And then about half of the time I am in office spaces, I am, having meetings, I'm doing, very directed thought leadership, and I'm in urban places, doing that kind of moving and shaking. And I love that too. I love taking the subway. I love putting on high heels and, doing my hair and going to meet people. And I have become more comfortable over the years bringing that part of my identity into the public space as well. I do think that a huge part of education is representation, and that so often the outdoor community has shown outdoor environmental professionals as one kind of thing. And I think we can all imagine what that one kind of thing is, but also as a person who is physically in nature all the time. And no matter what that person looks like, I also try my best to disrupt that idea, because I don't necessarily want people to know or to think that I'm physically in nature, in wild places, I should say. We're always in nature, but physically in wild places all of the time. And that's where the conservation work is done. A lot of my work is done, in the boardroom. A lot of my work is done, you know, when I'm taking a bath and just thinking and kind of processing a lot of information. A lot of the work is done when I'm, you know, walking my dog in my urban neighborhood. So that is something that I think showcases a little bit more about my authentic self, you know, kind of outside of the formal spaces where I show up. And I'm also someone who, you know, is pretty extroverted. I love to hang out with people. I love to, you know, get groups of women and female identifying folks together. I get a lot of power from that. I love music. In my past life, I was a musician, and I was in the classical music space for a long time. So, you know, I definitely have an interest in the arts. And I think I could go on. And so I'll pass it to Jen right now to kind of give us some of her hidden self. And I appreciate it, Jaime.
Great. Thanks so much. I could not be more honored to be sharing this forum with Dr. Ray Wynn-Grant. We had a chance to chat before, and you know, we didn't connect that we actually went to the same university. I went to Emory as well. Yeah, a few years before you.
Wow. Oh, we have so much in common. That says something.
Yes, I know. So, and Jaime, thank you so much. And thank you so much to NAAEE for having me here. I'm sitting here in my Zoom room in Washington, D.C., which is the ancestral home of the Anacostan people. And I just want to celebrate the gifts of this incredible place that I call home now, trying to do my best to take care of the treasure that they stewarded for so many years. So I was saying before we started that this is the first time that I have, in my year and a half being the CEO of the Nature Conservancy, been on a panel to talk about education. And I'm on panels probably 4 or 5 times a week. And so you add that up and it's hundreds of panels. So I think it's a really important reflection for me as I get started to share a little bit of my personal story of the incredible importance of education to me and to my life, but also the need to continuously remember this part of our work is so critical, and we need to talk about it more. We need to invest in it more, and we need to do phenomenal collaborations like we're starting with National Geographic, which Ray and I are talking about next week with the CEO of National Geographic. So it's really important that we're here today having this conversation. And maybe as Jaime asked me the question, I'll share just a few reflections on my journey. So I actually came to conservation through teaching, believe it or not. My first job after graduating from Emory was, I knew I wanted to travel. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I loved teaching, and I had done some volunteer teaching at university. So I moved to Japan, and I lived in a very small village in about 2 hours south of Tokyo. And I taught middle school to a bunch of wonderful Japanese kids who, many of whom, it was a pretty rural area, had never met someone who wasn't Japanese before. So being thrown into this cultural context and really learning about the challenges that teachers have, especially teaching foreign language in a place where there's a lot of amazing culture and a lot of opportunities to share life experiences. I knew through that I had the bug for teaching. I loved teaching so much, even though it was very challenging at times, being in a completely new culture, a new language, and everything else. And my lifelong journey up to then had been to live in Africa. So, but I graduated from school, I had no money. And so I went to Japan, saved my money, and joined a program called World Teach. And World Teach is a volunteer program that's still going on. It's out of Harvard University's education school, or School for International Development, excuse me. And I went to Namibia. And Namibia at the time, this was before Namibia kind of became relatively famous as a safari destination, had just come out of many, many years of war and independence from South Africa. And I lived in the very far north of the country on the border of Angola. And my job was to work with women in the villages to teach them how to teach English, because English was the independence language of Namibia. It no longer was going to speak Afrikaans, which is the language of apartheid in South Africa. And so there was this real desire to for adult women in particular to learn English. Their children spoke English, but really for women to regain their foothold in the workforce, they needed to have English. So I became a teacher trainer at 22 years old, and it changed my life. The things I learned, as Jaime mentioned, I learned about the real interconnections between women's empowerment, economic empowerment, and environmental stress, and how with continuous environmental stress, be it biodiversity loss, loss of soils, loss of water, quite frankly, those women could never use their education because they were constantly having to put food on their kids' tables, and of course, get water and energy and things that were becoming increasingly difficult to get in an increasingly arid and climate stressed world. So that sort of set me on to this journey of becoming a passionate women's educator, community activist, microfinance entrepreneur, and of course, environmentalist. And I take all of those three things and I bring them together. I try to, at least, in my daily life. I will say that even though I no longer am a formal teacher, teaching runs through my veins. My husband was a DC public school teacher for a while. I have a child who is in the 9th grade, 14 years old. And one thing I just think is so interesting is how, and we'll probably get into this a little bit, but how technology, she's taking biology right now and in high school. And she came home to me the other day and she said, Mom, they're telling me I need to download this app called iNaturalist. And we have to go out and we have to identify birds and species and ants. And we live in downtown DC. And I said, great, let's do that. It's fantastic. And she's like, oh, well, at least I get to use my phone. So that's a great part. So even though she is the daughter of the CEO of the Nature Conservancy, her ability and interest in nature is often stimulated through the technology that she has at her fingertips. So I love the opportunity that you all as conservation educators now have with these incredible tools, whether they're on laptops or iPads or iPhones, to connect to kids often where they are, and fortunately or not, that is through technology. So I'm so happy to be here. I can't wait to dive into the conversation, and thanks again for having me.
Excellent. I'm not sure who's braver, the black bear researcher or the person who decided to teach middle schoolers. Both can be dangerous in their own way. But thank you very much for that perspective, because I think as we weave this tapestry of getting to know each other in the audience, there are going to be lots of threads, and I will encourage you each to ask questions and pick up on those threads, and for our audience to chime in with questions as well. Now, I think that we have some responses to our poll because we also want to get to know our audience and where they're coming from. So the poll question was about which age groups they teach. There's a common understanding amongst the general public that maybe environmental education is just for little kids, but we know it's about teaching lots of different ages, in fact, everyone, across multiple disciplines, including science, but not limited to science. So as you can take a look here, these are some of our results. And you can see that a full 39% teach folks of all ages, from probably pre-K through retirees, if they're anything like me. And then K through 12, huge cluster there, 66. So those folks are teaching the people that will pick up on our journey from us, and we will pass the torch to. So very excited to have you both here. I'm going to pick up on a couple of threads in terms of your journey, and then we're going to watch a short video on Ray's work and in the field, and also the fact that she is this kind of person that inhabits different spaces, the wild and urban. We'll try to draw some connections between those two with both of you. So as you can see, we have lots of audience members from probably a lot of different backgrounds, a lot of entryways into the environmental education space. You both talked a little bit about your journey, and I want to pick up on a thread because sometimes, as somebody who works in the urban space, sometimes we tend to think of those urban zones where people are living more and more, and these iconic wild spaces that we work to protect as two different spots. So Ray, let me go ahead and start off with this question, since you both spend lots of times in cities. In terms of folks that might be on the call that also work in cities, can you talk a little bit about that dynamic of getting people excited about nature and conservation even if they're in the heart of a city, and what we might do from that aspect.
Yeah, sure. So thank you. This is really great. Very, very timely, because I find that almost all of the discussions that I've been having lately, especially regarding, some 30 by 30 initiatives, so the future of conservation in this country, a lot of those conversations revolve around, the role of urban spaces. And then
Okay, we have a little bit of a technological hiccup there. We'll hope that Ray can get back in here. Okay, I tell you what, she's going to have a really good answer for us. Let's go ahead and transition to you, Jennifer, to keep it moving along. Hopefully she'll just rejoin us. But as somebody that shepherds this very, very large conservation group that has saved these super iconic spaces, we have a country and a world that's rapidly urbanizing. And you talked about your daughter using iNaturalist, which we're huge fans of with the City Nature Challenge and other things. Can you talk about how TNC is thinking about the roles of cities and how that meshes with the more traditional work of land trusts in a highly dynamic space?
Yeah, so thanks for that. And hopefully Ray will come back. I know we all want to hear from her. So yes, TNC is, so much of our work is investing in people and clearly thinking about the role and the intersection within cities. And it also directly links to, of course, the important role that climate change has in accelerating inequities on our planet. So we're looking at, I'll give you a few examples, Jaime. We're doing some work in Louisville, Kentucky, for example, where we're looking at the inequities of tree growth and trees in general in cities, and how, I'm sure you've seen many articles about this now, but how it not only affects temperature, which has been the headline, but also how does it affect physical and mental well-being of residents who live in areas within an urban environment that have less access to nature, have less trees around, whether it's a small municipal park to an actual big park like we have here in Washington, D.C. in Rock Creek Park. That lack of access, it really, especially during COVID, as we all know, we've all taken such refuge in just walking outside. And if you have the fortune of being near a park or having even just some small little potted plants in your backyard, which is what I have, we need that. And without that, it really undermines people's mental and physical health. So we're looking at that actually on a scientific basis in Louisville as one. It's called the Green Heart Initiative, to really understand the connections between nature and cardiac and mental health as a longitudinal study. It's the first time ever we're looking at that. So that's just one of many examples. But the work that we're doing in cities is critical for us as an organization. We're doing a lot of work in climate change resilience and adaptation, and how the future of the city needs to evolve with our changing planet. And how do we ensure that we future-proof and climate-proof our cities, and especially in neighborhoods which have had unequal access to nature, as I mentioned before. But I see that Ray is back, so sorry about that, Ray.
No, I'm sorry for the heart attack. I'm sure that I gave you just now, but we're back. So thanks for bearing with me. I can't quite remember where I left off, but there was one.
Let me maybe reset it, because Jennifer gave a really good answer about this connection between urban conservation and connections to the more traditional work of land trusts, and how there's really a dynamic thread between climate resilience, health, and closing the inequity gap. So that's where she left off. And you were talking about this connection between your urban life and your wildlife as a researcher, and in all the work that you're doing, and how that dynamic can maybe encourage others to get into this field.
Yes, well, I'm so glad that Jen took time to mention, some gaps in equity and justice, because what comes to mind for me that I think could become a wider conversation with our audience members is the way that we as educators or environmentalists really have been pushing lately the idea that nature is everywhere, including in urban spaces, and urban spaces, contribute, and definitely in the future can significantly contribute to conservation. And what I really want to say is that I hope that all of us as a community can also add some nuance to that, those thoughts and that discussion. I know for myself, I grew up in some, really rough, low-income urban neighborhoods where I do really feel that it's tough to argue that there's a lot of wildness there, maybe beyond soil bacteria. And for so many students and young people that we are aiming to touch, especially those who live in communities that have a lot of environmental degradation, I do think that a lot of nuance and care needs to be taken when we suggest that nature is everywhere. Because in some places, nature really has been killed off almost entirely. And yet the people, in particular the young people who live in those places, have incredibly bright futures of being environmental leaders. But I think so many of us, and myself included, we really don't want to necessarily push a narrative that isn't true. I don't quite believe that nature is everywhere. I think it should be, and I think it can be easily, if we all get on board. But perhaps, as educators, we can really take a look at urban spaces, especially some of the most low-income urban spaces or environmentally degraded urban spaces, and talk about future visioning. So what do young people see now? What's missing? Where could it belong? And how can our urban spaces look their very, very best? And that way, I think so many young people don't necessarily have to follow my path. When I grew up in these low-income areas, I looked to TV shows to show me, what does nature look like? Because it's definitely not here. And it wasn't safe necessarily for me to be outside. So, my access to nature was virtually. And I think that's still okay, but wouldn't it be beautiful if so many of our young people in these spaces were able to go to, local parks, or outside was safer? And and that again speaks to this really comprehensive, nature of addressing environmental issues in education. We can't just enhance biodiversity. We also have to make, communities stronger. And so there's this social element that comes to environmental education and environmental protection that just needs to go hand in hand in this comprehensive way. And, I'm very, very proud of my journey, but I also definitely truly hope that other folks don't have to take a similar path, to get there. And that's really what I wanted to say about the urban spaces, is that they're full of potential. But also, when we are educating folks and talking about these concepts, let's make sure to be real about what they're like today.
Yeah, thank you for that nuanced answer, because I think it's somebody that is trying to put more nature into cities for climate resilience, but also for biodiversity and for mental and physical well-being. It's, as you both so well put it, it's not about just climate resilience. It's also about the awe of nature being accessible to everybody, especially during the pandemic. And I'm going to ask one more question on this thread, and then we'll go ahead and watch our first video, which is so exciting to watch. I actually watched it several times because I was so excited about it. So you mentioned this intersectionality, and I think both of you are leading change in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice within the institutions that you're working with. I'm here in a city, Houston, which is very climate disaster prone. We've gotten a lot of climate shocks and stressors. It's also a region that is the most ethnically diverse major metro in the area, and demographers tell us that in 2050, this is what America is going to look like. So it's a little bit of a place, a model to understand what's coming. But it's also a place where 80% of the youth under 18 are children of color. And we're seeing this happen at a time where we want to get more diverse, the environmental education space and the conservation space. So I guess talk to me a little bit about attending to that, the need to bring up this next generation to shepherd the biodiversity that we care for with some folks that maybe have not been engaged in that space or have not been represented in that space, and maybe some of the bright spots that you're seeing to do that. And you can also hopefully include some mention of how Indigenous folks are being better approached to work alongside us with that, because they have been shown to be such good stewards of the land. And I'll go with
Ray, do you
Jennifer,
wanna
if you could
start?
go first.
Okay, I
Hey,
was
Jen,
gonna let.
please start with this
Okay.
one. This is loaded.
Yeah, no,
Sorry.
it's a great question, Jaime. It's something that we obviously think and talk a lot about. So I think the first step is that young people can see themselves or people that look like themselves in jobs that they might want to have.
Mhm.
And I think if they don't see that, then it becomes harder for some people, not all, of course, but to break through some of those barriers and think, you know, that person looks similar to me. I can do that too. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do within my own institution is to really change who we hire, to really diversify and be intentional about the next generation of leaders at multiple levels. And so we're working very, very hard to do that. And I think that's a step in the right direction. But the other is making sure that we're recruiting in the right places, that we're training, and that we're not only providing, this is one maybe detail, but I think it's super important. So, you know, a lot of organizations like mine will have internships and will expect young 20, 19-year-old, 21-year-olds who often are saddled with college debt to work for free. And that just, we can't ask them to do that. So they don't, you know, not everyone comes from backgrounds that will enable them to subsidize themselves for a year. So how do we as professionals really think about paying the right prices, the right costs, the right salaries, the right support networks for people coming into our organizations that may not have that through their families or their communities? So that for me is critical. And I don't think we're ever going to change the next generation or face of conservation, at least in the NGO community, until we're more intentional about recruiting, retaining, sourcing, and paying for young people coming into our field. Right? What do you think?
Oh, I love everything that you said. I love the subject that we're discussing. You know, it's something I'm really passionate about without necessarily being an expert in this. And so, you know, I really often look to other folks who have an expertise in these exact issues. But I agree with everything that Jen said. And so just to add, I'm not going to repeat what she said, but maybe to add some additional things that come to mind for me. You know, Jaime, you teed us up to talk about intersectionality. You know, just to emphasize, everyone is intersectional. You know, every single person on this earth has an intersectional identity. And when we even talk about, you know, young people and people of color, you know, in parts of Texas, you know, that we're focusing on, there's so much diversity in that racial diversity, right?
Mhm.
So, you know, we're talking about people who are immigrants themselves, or the, you know, the children of immigrants, or fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, you know, who knows, generation Americans. You know, we're talking about, you know, people of color, young people of color who are super duper wealthy or living in poverty, you know, and everywhere in between. We're talking about young people of color who are Republican and Democrat and, you know, not yet identifying with a political party. You know, there's just so much there. And so I think that there's so much we can do, and two things I will focus on because I could just go on forever. But one is really making sure that environmental education, you know, kind of to Jen's point, includes a lot of information about career pathways. Because it's one thing to know a lot about something, and it's another thing to like have a really good understanding of how to get to a career you're interested in. And that also necessitates that we as an environmental community are able to really show the breadth of environmental careers. You know, if you're interested in art or interested in education or interested in, you know, music, or interested in design, or interested in, you know, in field work, or, you know, so many things, so many different strengths can make a young person a wonderful and incredibly effective environmentalist. And that's something that I'm sure none of us on this panel knew about when we were young. And I really want to make sure that a lot of people understand that, you know, whatever you're good at or whatever makes you excited to get up in the day can probably be used towards conservation. And that's really, really cool. And it also provides so many more opportunities for people to become wonderful stewards of the environment. Another thing that comes to mind is, I think, the importance of history, and that all kinds of education properly teaching history. I know I had a miseducation in American history, and it did not serve me very well. And as an adult, I'm relearning that, even my ancestors who were Black Americans, who, were part of the group of enslaved people who helped to build this country, were essentially wildlife ecologists in their own right. There was a long period of time where I would go on record saying, I'm the only Black, bear biologist in the United States, and the only one that I've ever known of. And I really have to retract a lot of those statements, because history, a deep dive that I took into historical records has taught me that a lot of my ancestors, didn't get their PhDs, but they definitely knew a lot about bears and a lot about forests and a lot about large carnivores. And they manipulated environments, and studied animals in very specific ways, even ways that eventually allowed enslaved people to escape from slavery and not get attacked by carnivores along the way. I've recently written a piece that was about Harriet Tubman and her understanding of large carnivore ecology, and how that understanding of large carnivore ecology behavior allowed her to be successful in getting people to escape from slavery. And that's just a little tiny piece of Black history. And we have such a rich, diverse American history with all different kinds of folks, that just imagine if that kind of proper history was taught in schools, how that type of representation would also be internalized, I think, by so many young folks. So they could say, even if they're not able to see themselves right now reflected in these fields, they know that they belong, and they know that there is, there are all these ways of knowing that come from a strong and powerful ancestry. And that's really important. And the last thing I'll say is something that is just on my heart a lot lately, especially in this pandemic, as we've seen hunger, and in particular child hunger, really surface even more than usual. And that's that in so many of these areas where we have, half the population is young people, hunger prevents any kind of progress. There are social issues that will keep, the next environmental leaders from becoming the next environmental leaders. And again, as long as we as an environmental movement and community can really think comprehensively about the basic needs of our fellow environmentalists, that will help us create a vibrant future workforce that can really change things.
That's amazing. So for those of you out in the audience, we're about to take some questions from you. So take this opportunity to put some questions in the chat. As you can tell, I think we could all sit here and listen to both these thoughtful leaders all day, because it's just a font of wisdom. But it also points out something to me. As I started my career as an environmental educator, I was really teaching about basic ecology, about biodiversity. But now this field of conservation and environmental education is so multidimensional, so intersected. So if you're a new professional coming into the field, welcome to one of the most dynamic and exciting places to work, and a place that's reinventing itself all the time. Okay, with that said, I think we're going to go ahead and watch a video that's going to show you how dynamic this is. And then we're going to come back and take some questions. And then we're going to get back to the dialogue. And this time we're going to talk about the 2030 goals and how education can be better situated there. All right.
My name is Wynn-Grant, and I'm a large carnivore ecologist and a National Geographic explorer. I try to study the behavioral differences of wild animals. Right now I study bears in very pristine natural areas, and then at the interface that we call the human-wildland interface, where people and animals overlap. I am a part of a team of scientists all over the world trying to save endangered species from extinction. And I'm inspired every day because I do have opportunities to see when it's working. Bald eagles were on the verge of extinction, and now they're back in full force. Black bears were on the verge of extinction, and now they're quite abundant. They have been taken off the endangered species list. So it's successes like that that continue to inspire me every day. I discovered large carnivore ecology when I first discovered my love for the outdoors and for wild animals. I was born in an urban center, and I loved watching TV, in particular nature shows. I wanted to do exactly what those nature show hosts did. However, I didn't necessarily see myself represented in that, right? I was so different from those TV hosts that I saw. I went to school, I got off track, started being pre-med, decided that wasn't for me, stumbled into environmental science, and I was doing a study abroad program, which took me all the way to southern Kenya, and it captured me. And in particular, the big cats captured me. So the lions, the leopards, the cheetahs were what I loved the most. And I talked to my professors out there who said, well, those are all the large carnivores. And I said, done. I want to study the ecology of large carnivores. For work, I often feel like I have a double life. And so it's either a field day or an office day. So a typical day in the field is really intense, but pretty routine. Waking up at 6 a.m. with the sunlight, finding my animals, monitoring them, observing their behavior, making a little fire, cooking a little dinner, and then bed when the sun sets and there's no more light around 6 or 7. Office days are also exciting in a very different way because that's when I'm usually doing data analysis. So all the data that I'm collecting in the field, I bring back, put it into spreadsheets, open a statistical software, and I can actually turn a lot of those numbers into maps, really colorful maps that can show what animals are doing on a landscape and really speak to all kinds of people. The best piece of advice I've ever gotten that I really internalized is that there are no rules. And for me, I applied that message to my career path. I, for a long time, struggled with how do I get to a certain place and what choices do I need to make and do I need to always take a traditional route? And realizing that there really are no rules to this thing called life, and in particular, non-traditional careers, has really helped me. And that's something that I hope all kids can really learn.
All right, that was very exciting. Several people asked to have that video link put in the chat. I think it's really incredible and very inspiring. Ray, as you did, I watched a lot of, I didn't go camping when I was a kid, we couldn't afford to. So I watched a lot of Wild Kingdom. I'm kind of dating myself there. But it was very exciting. It's a form of communication. Environmental education is so important. So we're gonna go ahead and take 2 questions from the audience as promised. And then we're going to move on to the 2030 goals, and I'll start with asking a few questions of Jennifer, and then we'll move forward from there. So Anne, I believe, is going to provide us with 2 questions for our wonderful panelists.
Yes, I'm going through the chat here, Jaime, and I'm not seeing too many specific for the panelists just yet, but let's invite folks again to drop their questions into the chat if they've got them.
Okay. I tell you what, as you guys think of that great question, we're going to go ahead and roll on, and then we'll make sure to break in for some of your questions. Jennifer, there is something kind of existential happening this week. We're talking about biodiversity and the role of biodiversity in the sustainability of the planet. That sounds very huge and very big, but that's basically what's happening in China this week. I know that you are very engaged in that process. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening there, and what are some of the outcomes that you and other conservation leaders are trying to get on the table for our planet, really, but especially for just the next, until 2030? What are some of those goals look like?
Sure, happy to. So yes, what Jaime's referring to is the Conference of Parties for the Convention on Biological Diversity, shorthand as CBD, and it's their 15th Conference of Parties. Unlike climate, the biodiversity movement, I'd say is probably, I don't know, Ray, what do you think, 20, 30 years behind the climate movement, yes, just in terms of a holistic coming together, setting global targets. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But what we're trying to get done here, and this is a 2-part COP, if you will, Conference of Parties. The high level segment is happening, actually happened really yesterday, and all the big speeches, Xi Jinping, from China, Premier of China, as well as many other world leaders gave brief presentations. There was some new money pledged as well. The negotiations around the new treaty will happen actually in person in late April, early May in Kunming, China. And the goal there is really to set a new global ambition around biodiversity. So, you all probably know about the Paris Agreement and the climate talks and the goals to keep the world on a path that's below 1.5 degrees Celsius and increased temperature above the industrial era. So what we're trying to do in biodiversity is something similar. So to increase the level of ambition for every single country that's a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity to come forward with new ambitious goals similar to Paris, but very specific to biodiversity. And the ambitions so far, I'll be honest, have not been phenomenal. They have been a little bit lackluster. They have not, as we all know from conservation science, and Jaime mentioned this a little bit before, they are not to where they need to be for us to really make measurable change. There's a huge funding gap. So we know that we did the Nature Conservancy with the Paulson Institute, and Cornell University actually did a study a few months ago, which said that the gap to fully fund what we need to do to achieve our biodiversity goals, the gap in funding is about $700 billion a year. And that's the bad news. The good news is almost half of that is actually from perverse subsidies. So if we change the way that governments are financing unsustainable agriculture, if we reduce the incentives for the forestry industry to do deforestation in a lot of countries, if we really flipped the script on nature and embrace the value of natural capital in the same way that we're thinking about climate change, in the same way that we value social capital and other types of capital, financial capital, then we could really have a different world for ourselves now and certainly for our children. So this is what's happening now, and many organizations are deeply engaged, and it's an exciting time period. For those of you teaching environmental education now, if you want any other information about the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, for your students, we'd be happy to put some links in the chat for you, because it is important to let students know about why this time, while we're talking about Glasgow and climate, that's great and that's important, but the biodiversity crisis continues unabated and is equally, if not more, of a crisis in many ways than climate.
My goodness, that was fantastic, and also just such a great rallying cry, right, for all of us, that not enough is being done, and so many of our global leaders are falling short, but there is a lot of reason to be hopeful. Jaime, I don't have too much to add to this because Jen is really on top of it. She is one of the leaders in all of these conversations, and I will say that one of the things that is strongly on my mind, unfortunately kind of constantly these days, and I'm trying to get better sleep at night, but it's in trying to figure out the smaller parts, the smaller bits of solving the biodiversity crisis. To Jen's point, many of us are taught about the power and the importance of protected areas, and that's what 30 by 30 is all about, right? Creating spaces on the land and in the water that are outlined on a map that are protected for biodiversity. And then from the kind of biology standpoint, the scientific standpoint, these essentially islands of protected areas are not useful unless they're connected to each other, right? So we have, it's easy to imagine, large animals who quite literally need to walk on their 4 paws from one protected area to another. But there's also plants that need to move. There are birds that need to move. There are tiny little organisms that need to move. All of these animals and plants and different, organisms move around naturally. And with climate change, we'll need to continue to move around and be highly mobile. And that's where the issue of corridors or pathways or connectivity really comes into play, and it's kind of complicated. It's not obvious. Sometimes the best corridors for, let's use wildlife as an example, are the worst corridors for people to place them. And so there's this puzzle piece, and I'm happy to say Jen and I and some partners are sprouting some ideas around this right now. But we feel that 30 by 30 goals will require a huge connectivity element. And that's also something that any and everybody can get behind and think about and observe and make suggestions to. And it'll be an ongoing, I think, for as long as humanity's on this planet, connectivity will need to be worked on. So the folks that we're educating today are going to be dealing with these issues tomorrow and 100 years from now. So it's a really, really great conversation that just really enriches the possibilities for 30 by 30.
Yeah, that's excellent. We're going to actually pick up on both of your threads in terms of that connective tissue between not only physical nature, but cognitive. Jennifer did such a great job of describing that financial gap from where we should be and where we are. And there's also a cognitive gap between people's understanding of biodiversity and what it actually means. So we'll pick up on that. We're going to get a couple of questions first. It looks like people have been really streaming questions in now. So Anne, I'm going to invite you on to ask a couple of questions of our panelists, and then we'll get back to that notion of connectivity in the 2030 goals.
So many great questions now. Mary and De La Fruz are asking you both, what helps you stay hopeful and motivated when you feel overwhelmed by the huge environmental and social challenges that we're confronted with?
You want me to start? Okay, I'll start. People like Ray. Honestly, like, she's amazing, right? She's incredible. And the community that we have of professionals is phenomenal. I mean, I wake up every day and I get the pleasure to be a part of an organization of over 4,000 people who don't do it for the money. They're here for the mission, and they're just incredibly passionate. I would also say that what keeps me hopeful is what we can do as a collective community, and seeing what we have done with vaccines and the challenges there of not getting vaccines in the arms of the people who really need it most, especially in other countries, is really key. But the fact that we can all come together as a collective community and create a vaccine in record time that's safe and effective gives me incredible hope for what we can do on some of the biggest challenges of our time. So those two things certainly give me hope. But then, of course, my daughter and the youth and the passion. I was in France recently, and at a big environmental conference, and Harrison Ford was on stage, and he said it best about the youth. He said, "There are reinforcements coming, and we just need to get out of their way." And I just thought that was so. And he said it was very, Harrison Ford voice, very scary. But I think that's just so powerful. But also to recognize that, to Jaime, to your question, we need to get out of the way, but we also need to arm people with the science and the information that they need, and frankly, the opportunities, so that they can maximize their ability to contribute to conservation in the generations to come. So that's what keeps me hopeful. Ray, what about you?
Oh yeah. Oh, I'm an optimist, you can probably tell, but there's so many reasons to be hopeful. Absolutely. I would argue the environment is not necessarily in better shape than ever, but most things are better than ever, right? I mean, most things on this planet are doing better than ever, even socially. And because the environment is connected to everything else, I think that focusing on one major point of progress can hopefully give hope to all these other areas of the environment that we're focused on. I've talked a lot, or we've kind of mentioned and really acknowledged the role of race and, social justice in so much of this conversation. I can think about my own family's history. I'm a millennial. I think I'm a geriatric millennial, but that counts, and I'm the first person in my family to be born with civil rights. And that's a really big deal. And that's better than before. It's not perfect, but that's like a lot better than before. And, and technology is, better than ever and can be used for so many of these issues, and women's right. I mean, like, we're talking to a female CEO of the biggest environmental nonprofit in this country, if not the world. Things are better. And, it doesn't take being an eternal optimist to be able to see that society is moving in the right direction. Also, I'm not necessarily shy about my politics. And so also, like, the last election really helped, I think, in terms of keeping hope alive. And then I will say, much more anchored to, who I am and what I do professionally. I'm super unapologetic about loving megafauna, right? The big, furry, awesome animals that are just so cuddly and important to our culture. There's a lot of wild animals that are doing great that used to be on the brink of extinction. I work with bears a lot, but my favorite animal is actually the bald eagle. And it was my favorite when I was a kid in the 90s, and they were on the brink of extinction. So bald eagles were going nowhere fast, and it was really alarming. And today they are not on the endangered species list. They are flying free, they're beautiful, they're all over the place. And so there are examples of that, of large, charismatic, iconic animals that we have literally worked together to save from going extinct. And more of that is in the future. It's hard and there's a lot of barriers, but I truly believe that more of that is in the future, especially to Jen's point with arming, the younger generations with what they need to be successful leaders.
Yeah, I think that anybody who's engaged in this process of conservation education needs to do self-care. And I think we're learning more and more about that we can't carry all of this weight without first taking care of ourselves so we can give somebody else oxygen, right? So great points there. We're going to take one more question, and then we're going to go ahead and head towards our final question session. I did put in the chat, Nature Conservancy has put together a real dynamic suite of educational materials that we're gearing towards you. So it's in the chat now. Judy, you have one question to share, and then we'll watch a real quick video about biodiversity that Nature Conservancy just released as a suite of videos, and then we'll get to that last suite of questions.
What a great conversation. And we do have a lot of questions, but I'm going to take one from Hannah, who said, what percentage of time and resources do you feel are appropriate for a scientific organization to dedicate to environmental education, community engagement, and training to truly move toward an ideal future for our planet? And somebody else asked the same for what should the conservation groups do to promote environmental education and incorporate that as a priority into their institutions.
Sure, I can start with that one. So I'm not sure I know a specific number in terms of percentage. It depends on the organization, of course. I think that, we need to do whatever we can. I will just share with this group, I think that there's a couple of challenges and opportunities with NGOs doing environmental conservation. And one is that often our funders want really specific measurable outcomes. And it's something that I struggle with all the time, because education, they don't want just how many people did you teach. They want to know, what did they do with that information? How did it impact their lives? And those are sometimes things to measure. And you all as educators know how challenging that can be at times. So our funding sometimes doesn't match with the longer term impact that we're trying to have. And I know that has been a barrier within the Nature Conservancy of getting to the scale that the funders want to see, of getting to the impact that they can readily identify and check a box. And sometimes there's a mismatch between that type of financing and the impact that we're trying to have. But I will say that in terms of trainings and, as we talked about earlier, opportunities for career paths, that's something that we need to do a lot more of. I would also say that, I'm seeing increasingly the opportunities, and Jaime put in Nature Lab into the chat, for us to provide you all as educators with the best in class science that's happening now. That's, not just things that are maybe in the textbook, but are also like real life examples, whether it's the Convention on Biological Diversity or very specific research initiatives that we're doing that are happening in real time, that we can do a better job to arm you in the schools and in the workplaces and everywhere you're teaching, to make sure that you have access to that information. And for me, that's almost a better way to scale, not to say that we're not going to continue as TNC and WWF and others that are doing great work in education. But ultimately, this needs to be taught in schools just like geography. It needs to be just like history, and the right kind of history. It needs to be just like math. Every single child growing up in the world needs to understand the interconnectedness of themselves and nature and ecosystems, and why nature and natural capital is just as important as anything else that they're learning. And until we change that, until we really flip the script on what it is to be a citizen in a world that is changing so rapidly from climate change, we are never going to change this planet. So what all you are doing right now in your places and spaces around the world is so important. So we are here as nature conservancies to help provide the data that we can, but I just want to salute all of you, because you are teaching the future and the present of leaders that we need as those informed reinforcements to take on this incredibly important journey that we have as a human race. Thanks. That was a lot, sorry.
Can we just clip all of that out and just put it immediately into social media? That was such a wonderful answer. I just am very jazzed about that. Ray, do you have any thoughts, responses?
Oh, how could I? No, that question was aimed at the right person. It was about, nonprofit organizations, and we have, the leader of the nonprofit, in my opinion, here answering that. And so I think it's wonderful. If I were to offer anything, I would say, really reinforce informal education, because that can look like a lot of things, and a lot of young people really thrive from informal education, whatever that might look like. Jaime, you just mentioned social media. I learned recently that social media sites, and this is now making me, date myself, but, for example, TikTok, under the pandemic conditions became really important education sites. So my understanding is that pre-COVID, TikTok was all the cute dances, but, once people were stuck inside, and especially for young people, phones became their access to the world, folks had a longer attention span and were more likely to look at TikToks and social media videos that had text on it that explained things. And I would not have predicted that. And I don't think, many of us would have, but if any environmental organization, especially the small ones, that struggle with funding, if there's any ability to do science communication, that's important education work. And it can be informal, and it can be fun, and it can hit all kinds of people. And that's something that even the big orgs do. The Nature Conservancy has really, really great social content. I believe World Wildlife Fund has like a active TikTok, so that's another just really great way to do a little bit of something, and it's definitely making a difference.
Yeah, one of the things that keeps me motivated is I follow both of you on social. It's just exciting to see what the forefront of conservation is happening and how people are being connected to the field in different ways. So yeah, social media is great. We're going to look at a piece of science communication that I thought was super well done. We're going to see a 3-minute video from Nature Conservancy on what is biodiversity, to help maybe close that gap with the general public, so that they don't just see biodiversity as good for itself, but they see it great for us. And then we're going to come back and we're going to have some closing remarks, and then Judy will lead us out.
Our planet is incredibly beautiful, isn't it? Not that it's any surprise, with billions of species roaming the Earth, from microbes to baobab trees, all the way up to blue whales. And it's all interconnected, like dragonflies with 28,000 lenses per eye, or peacocks with microscopic crystals tinting their feathers. And even the insects they eat and every other part of their habitats too. So what if all that variety disappeared? It wouldn't be so great. And it might not be that far off. Extinctions are rising faster than ever before. The difference? Us, humans. Since we came along, species have been dropping out 100 times faster than the natural rate. And get this, biodiversity that's the assortment of life on Earth, is super important for maintaining the health of our environment, not to mention our food supply and our economy, like the bees that pollinate our crops, or the forests that clean the air and filter our water. Penicillin? You can thank a fungus for that. And biodiversity deserves some credit for all the likes your vacation photos have been racking up. Pretty much everything is balancing on, well, everything else. Like mangroves. They're a birthing ground for parrotfish, and those little guys grow up to clean algae off coral reefs. Without them, reefs would suffocate, and fish would stop gathering. And then sharks and dolphins, even fishermen, would have to find other places to hunt. Plus, mangroves and reefs also protect us from big storms like hurricanes and tsunamis. And that's just one habitat. Each one of those supports the greater global ecosystem. Remove just one piece of that puzzle and the entire thing becomes vulnerable. Pull too many pieces, it could all crumble. That's what biodiversity really means. But it's not too late. We can slow the extinctions and save the planet. If we protect our wild ecosystems and change our habits to help restore the lands we've already degraded, which is no small task, it means changing how we approach infrastructure, the ways we farm, and even the behaviors our economies reward around the world. No biggie though. We've landed robots on Mars. We got this. If we can agree to prioritize it. Because it's going to take bold public leadership and private investment. But this is a goal we can all get behind, right? Because we're a part of this biodiversity thing too. And preserving all that means preserving ourselves.
There's actually a whole new suite of really great conservation snippet videos that are designed in the time frame that people have to watch these things and get engaged. So I'm really excited about that new suite of videos from Nature Conservancy. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to wrap up a bit. We've talked a lot about conservation, your journey. We've talked about intersectionality, which I was really hoping that surfaced, how to reach out to more urban folks, and also some different strategies for how to really ramp up environmental education alongside conservation to get to more scalable, better outcomes. So, one thing that occurred to me when you said that you guys are going to meet next week to talk about this dynamic between TNC and Nat Geo, I just love hearing things like that because it seems that collaboration is really so critical to getting everybody to where we all need to go, and we're always stronger together. So I'm very excited about that. Do you have closing remarks for our guests, our wonderful practitioners in the field about the role of education and how you see this dynamic continuing to evolve? Because you both mentioned that this is a forever process. We all have kids. We're going to see them working on this. So any closing thoughts about things you heard today or how education is fitting in with our conservation goals for biodiversity or other things?
Ray, you want to go first?
Okay, I'll go first. It's sometimes it's hard for me to be concise, but first I want to express as much gratitude as possible to all of the educators with us today, because again, I think I started by saying this, but I would be nothing without the education I've received and without a lot of the really careful attention that I got from my educators as well. That made probably the biggest difference. And I know that it is at a personal cost and expense so often, to the individual. And so I am super, super grateful to everyone who's an educator. And then, Jen mentioned teacher trainers too. And, that's a group that I don't know quite as much about. And, it's sinking in with me that teacher trainers, my goodness, are so, so, so critical to this movement as well. So a big offer of thanks. And then just, again, probably my main point that you've heard me echo throughout this time together is about the comprehensive nature of all of this work. In particular, I'm partial to environmental education, but sometimes, the educator that will be most important in creating a future environmental leader might not be the environmental educator. I think I noticed that someone put in the chat, what was one of the most impactful educators you ever had in your life? And the ones that I'm thinking about were, absolutely, some of the Black women who were my professors in my life, and they were not scientists and they were not in the environmental space. They were in African American history or the English department, etc. But the mentorship I received from them and the care that I received from them and the self-confidence boost that I received from them helped me to be here today. And so, working together as this big global comprehensive group of educators that leads with care is something that I just hope to continue to encourage. And I also hope to play a strong role in that as well. So just a big thank you to all the work that you all do. Thanks.
I can't really do much more to follow on that. That was amazing, Ray. And again, Jaime, Ray, it's been such a pleasure to be with both of you. You're just wonderful, wonderful human beings and incredible educators. And this time has been just terrific. I would say the one thing that, I have to be honest. I mean, so we went to the same school. I was an English major. African-American literature actually at Emory, and I did not come to conservation until I got to it through women and through women living in Africa. And so if I had one sort of thing that, thinking about both of our stories and very different journeys, but in many ways some intersections, is to not just teach, if you're a science educator, the data, but to get to touch people's hearts, whether they're adults or kids, and through stories and through experiential learning, if you can, of course. And I know all of you are probably amazing at that, but not just drive with the data and the science, which is incredibly important, but to create the next cadre of passionate conservationists, whether they're accountants, investment bankers, or actually environmentalists, to just care. Often it's not just about the data and the science, but it's right here. And so, whether you bring in the literature that talks about, and there's so much great nature literature that's fiction and nonfiction, that's youth and adult fiction and nonfiction now, that didn't exist, I don't think, or at least I wasn't aware of it when I was growing up, and the ability to bring that into the classroom, even if it's a science classroom, and sort of connect the dots for kids, maybe through summer reading or other things, as well as adults. I just love, love, love that opportunity to touch both hearts and minds, and really just create this next generation, and to really bring people who don't necessarily believe in climate change or don't understand how it impacts them, some literature that can really help them understand why it's not just about what's happening far, far away on an island in the South Pacific, but it is about fires and floods and droughts and changes in farming practices as a direct result of changing weather patterns. So there's so much that can connect in ways that I think are inspirational. And thank you for allowing us to spend a little time to share our stories. Thanks.
I feel like I just witnessed a double mic drop. Those were such incredible answers. And I can't thank you enough, because we do have an inkling of how busy both of you are. You're both international leaders, and we just can't thank you so much for spending all your time, but also giving us so much to think about. So we talked about bright lights. You guys are two of those bright lights, keeping us moving forward. We appreciate the time. And now I'm going to turn it over to Judy to close this out.
Hi, everyone. So sorry about the technical issues. You were all so wonderful. Jaime, you are such a wonderful moderator. Thank you so, so much. And Ray and Jennifer, that was one of the best conversations I have ever heard about conservation and education. And I hope you've been looking at the chat. The love is there. We need to do more of this. And as Jaime said, two of the busiest, most wonderful people in conservation spent time with us. Thank you. And Jaime, you are one of them. So thank you all so much. Wonderful, wonderful discussion. Have a wonderful rest of the conference. And Jennifer, Ray, and Jaime, you just made our year. We have so much to do together. Thank you.